All right, so you've made it to Binge Guy, the next show. You're here because you want to know what you should watch next. And let me tell you, you're in the right place. We are diving deep into a new cyber thriller that just might grab you. Drop. It comes out in theaters April 11th, and let me tell you, it's going to be a wild ride.
Yeah, Drop is definitely one to watch. It premiered at SXSW 2025, and the buzz is already out there. People are talking about this one. It's a tense, edge-of-your-seat kind of film.
Now, the guy behind this, Christopher Landon, you might recognize his name. You know he's done Happy Death Day, those films, and the wild body swap flick, Freaky. But he's also got a history with the Paranormal Activity movies. So, safe to say, he knows a thing or two about building suspense, but Drop seems to be a bit of a departure for him, going full-on thriller. What do you think about that with his background?
I think it's super interesting. I mean, this guy, Landon, he's really good at mixing things up, you know? Like taking a familiar idea and giving it a whole new twist. So even though Drop is being called a straight-up thriller, I wouldn't be surprised if there were some little hints of his horror style, or even that dark humor he does so well, like maybe a little wink to the audience, you know? Makes you wonder if he's going for something totally different this time.
Oh, absolutely. That's something I'll be keeping an eye out for sure. And we've got a pretty stellar cast here, too. Megan Fahey, she was incredible in The White Lotus, and Brandon Sklenar, he's making a name for himself in 1923. And they're the ones stuck in this, what I can only imagine is a terrifying first date scenario. What do you think about their dynamic, given the whole premise of the movie?
Well, their chemistry is going to be key, that's for sure. Like the early scenes, they have to feel real, relatable. You got to believe in their connection so that when things go south, it really hits you. And Fahey's character, Violet, she's a single mom and she's a survivor of abuse, you know. So she's cautiously getting back into the dating world. Sounds like a character with a lot of depth, a lot of strength, but also vulnerability. It'll be interesting to see how she handles this whole mess, all while trying to, you know, connect with Henry, Sklanar's character. Oh, and speaking of Henry, he's supposed to be super charming, but is he really? You know what I mean? There's got to be something more there. So yeah, they're dynamic. It's going to make or break this movie. It's the heart of it all.
Right. Okay, so let's talk about the setup. We meet Violet. She's played by Megan Fahey, and like you said, she's a survivor. She decides to go on this first date with Henry, played by Brandon Sklenar. They meet at this fancy restaurant, Palette, in Chicago, and it's not just any restaurant. It's high up in the city, this elegant, almost isolated setting. I feel like the location itself is going to be a character in this film. What do you think about that?
Oh, I totally agree. Having this very refined, very public space become the backdrop for like intensely private terror, it's a brilliant contrast. I mean, she's surrounded by people, but completely alone in this nightmare. And being up so high, that just adds to that feeling of isolation. And think about it, she's on a date, right? So she has to pretend everything's fine, even while she's dealing with this horrifying situation. That adds a whole other layer of tension.
Oh yeah, it's like a performance on top of everything else. And speaking of performance, that's when the digidrops come in. These untraceable messages start popping up on Violet's phone. At first, they seem harmless, you know, like random digital junk. But then, things take a dark turn. Fast. What makes these digidrops so important to the whole threat, you know, the danger?
It's so clever, right?
Yeah.
It takes something so ordinary, like we've all seen airdrop memes and stuff,
Yeah.
and turns it into this weapon, this tool for terror. It's not like some complicated hack. It's just like these everyday messages. But that's what makes it so scary. It feels real, relatable. I mean, who hasn't gotten a random airdrop?
Mhm.
And the messages, they reveal that her sister and son are being held hostage by this masked man. It plays on that fear we all have, that technology can be used against us in ways we never imagined.
And here's the kicker. The film sets up this rule, this 50-foot proximity thing. So Violet and us watching, we know the person tormenting her is right there in the restaurant. How do you think that adds to the suspense?
Oh man, that 50-foot rule, that's genius. It immediately makes everyone around her suspicious. The waiter, the bartender, the people at the next table, anyone could be behind those messages. And that creates this constant paranoia for Violet and for us. We're constantly looking around trying to figure out who it could be. It makes the threat so personal, so immediate, it's like you can feel it closing in on her.
And visually, they went all out with how they show these messages. It's not just like little text bubbles on a phone. It's these big digitized words that reflect off everything around Violet. What do you think that adds to the film?
It's a brilliant visual choice. It takes the threat out of the phone, you know? It's not just something she can ignore. It's all around her, impossible to escape. It becomes part of her reality, and that's terrifying. And visually, it's got to be stunning, right? It keeps the movie dynamic, even though a lot of it takes place in this one location.
And that location, the restaurant, it's like a character in itself. A lot of the film unfolds within those walls, and it's got to create this claustrophobic feeling, even in a big space. How does that impact Violet being stuck there?
It's like a pressure cooker, you know? She's trapped, not just physically, but socially too. She's on a date, trying to act normal, but she's getting these horrific instructions and she can't let anyone know what's happening. The fear of, like, making a wrong move, alerting her tormentor or even Henry to what's going on, it's immense. Every word, every glance, it's loaded with tension. And her struggle to keep it together, to hide her fear, that's where the real drama comes in.
And just to keep us on our toes, there are all these other characters in the restaurant: the waiter, the piano player, a bartender, even someone she bumps into earlier. They all become part of the mystery. How does that play into the thriller aspect?
Oh, that's classic whodunit stuff, right? It's like we're playing detective right along with Violet. You're watching everyone, trying to figure out, are they acting suspicious? Do they seem off? It keeps you guessing, keeps you engaged. You're not just passively watching, you're actively trying to solve this mystery. And on top of that, you have the immediate threat, this constant sense of danger. It's a great combination.
And at the center of it all are Megan Fahey and Brandon Sklenar, and it sounds like their chemistry is what makes this crazy premise believable. How important is that believability for a film like this?
Oh, it's essential. If you don't buy their connection, then the whole movie falls apart. You have to feel invested in them, in their story, in order to feel that fear, that tension. And from what I've heard, their early interactions are supposed to be awkward but sweet, you know, like a real first date. That makes the terror hit even harder because you've seen that spark between them. And Fahey, she's got to be captivating as this woman fighting to protect her family. And Sklenar, he's got to walk that line between charming and maybe, you know, a little shady. It's a tricky balance. But if they pull it off, it'll be a knockout performance.
But here's the thing, it starts as this really contained thriller, all taking place in this restaurant. But then, from what I've read, in the third act, it kind of shifts gears. It becomes more of a conventional thriller. What do you think about that kind of change?
That's a tough one. It could be great, you know. It could open up the story, give it a bigger scope. But there's also the risk that it loses that claustrophobic feel, that intensity that was built up in those first two acts. The key is whether it feels natural, you know. Does the transition make sense, and can they keep that momentum going? It's a challenge, for sure, to balance this unique premise with a satisfying, maybe more traditional ending. We'll have to see how they pull it off.
And from what I've heard, the whole digidrop thing, which is so crucial in the beginning, it kind of fades into the background as the movie goes on. What do you think about that?
It's a gamble, for sure. I mean, when you have a hook like that, you kind of expect it to be front and center the whole time. But, you know, maybe they found a way to weave it into the story in a different way, even if it's not as in your face. As long as the stakes stay high and Violet's story is compelling, it could still work. It really comes down to the execution. Can they keep us hooked, even as things change?
Now, despite this shift in the story, people are still praising Christopher Landon's direction, saying he uses the camera in a really energetic way to keep things moving. How important is that visual style in a thriller, especially when the story is evolving?
It's huge. Visuals are everything in a thriller. The way the camera moves, it can create that sense of urgency, that feeling of being on edge. It can also enhance the mood, like that claustrophobia you mentioned. And if it's done well, it can make those transitions feel smoother, more natural. If the visuals are strong, they can carry you through even the most unexpected twists and turns.
And beyond the thrills, there's talk that Drop touches on some deeper themes, like vulnerability, especially for women who've been through abuse, and that feeling of being trapped and unheard. Given Violet's past, how do you think these themes come into play?
It's really interesting, right? Violet's past trauma, it informs everything about how she reacts to this situation.
Yeah.
It could be about, like, how past experiences shape your response to new threats, how you cope, how you fight, and that feeling of being trapped, of not being in control, which is sadly a reality for so many people who've been through abuse. It's magnified in this story. It adds a whole other layer of meaning to the film, a psychological depth that goes beyond just the surface level thrills.
And for Christopher Landon, this is a pretty big change, going from horror comedy to straight thriller. What does this tell us about him as a filmmaker?
I think it shows he's got range.
Yeah.
You know, he's not just a one-trick pony. He can handle different genres, different tones, and still create that suspense that keeps you hooked.
Yeah.
It's exciting to see him explore new territory, to see what he does with a purely thriller story. And for fans of his other work, it's a chance to see a different side of him, to see how his style evolves. It's a bold move, and I'm curious to see how it pays off.
So wrapping things up, Drop is a fresh take on the thriller genre, using technology in a way that feels really relevant today. The setting, that confined restaurant, promises a truly intense experience. And with Megan Fahey and Brandon Sklenar leading the way, it sounds like we're in for a real emotional roller coaster.
Absolutely. If you're looking for a movie that will keep you guessing, keep you on the edge of your seat, then Drop is definitely worth checking out. It's got that unique premise, the digidrop thing, that really sets it apart. And with Christopher Landon at the helm, you know it's going to be stylish and suspenseful.
Drop hits theaters on April 11th. Will Violet make it out of this terrifying first date? Who is behind those messages? We'll have to wait and see.
It really makes you think, though, doesn't it? About how technology can be used, how vulnerable we are in this digital age. It's a scary thought.
Well, on that note, thanks for joining us for Binge Guide, the next show. We hope this deep dive has helped you figure out your next watch, your next obsession. Tune in next time for another look at the latest releases.